think of ourselves as the most powerful beings in the universe, it's unsettling to discover that we're wrong. Time has come to see the world as it is.
Can we pull back the veil of static and reach into the source of all being? Behind this curtain lies this random pattern generator. You will be responsible for an escalation that will destroy everything.
On this episode, I'll read some entries about some amazing lucid dreams I've had. For those of you who do not know, a lucid dream is a dream where you are fully aware that you are asleep and can take full control of your actions. It's something that scientists used to insist was completely and utterly impossible, so anyone who had claimed to have done it, they said, is most definitely certainly a liar, until a very prominent sleep scientist had lucid dreams himself, and then actually founded a group to teach people how to have lucid dreams. Alright, September 20th, 2017. Wow. I just woke up from an extremely intense series of lucid dreams, possibly crossing over into some astral projection. There were massive hangars filled with shiny, brightly colored aircraft and crowds of people. There was a gigantic window looking out over a plain where many different kinds of bovine animals ran about, some of them massive and prehistoric. While I was looking out, I began singing opera in a loud and beautiful voice. As I was doing it, I couldn't understand how I was, but kept going because it was so enjoyable. I woke up and then drifted back to sleep again. At first I was lying in bed, then I began hearing a loud and continuous series of sounds, rushing, banging, alarms, etc., and was actually a bit worried that the sounds may continue when I got out of bed. I then found myself sliding down a dark tunnel like a water slide. I remember the sides were rotating slowly. When I got to the bottom of this, I found myself in a severely alien place. Everything was dark metal and menacing red light. The light was very thick and heavy, and it felt almost oppressive. No, it was very oppressive. These grim halls were populated by 10-foot-tall maggoty worm-like beings, which held themselves vertically upright and walked about on a bunch of tentacle-like legs, possibly about 6 legs. The top of their bodies also had tentacles or antennae sprouting off of a rounded bit at the end. It's funny because a friend of mine pointed out that that description sounds very much like the appearance of the etheric parasites I've been describing. There were also the bloodied and mangled bodies of what looked like some other very non-humanoid beings lying on the floors or hung up on the steel cage or scaffolding-type metal structures which comprised the walls and ceiling, like they had been tortured. Often, the maggot beings would be hanging onto the corpses as if they were mating with them or laying eggs. I wasn't afraid of this place, only fascinated, but it was incredibly, remarkably awful. I also remember a dark industrial place, looking like a set from Alien or a Borg ship from Star Trek, which was populated by people in strange costumes, like the people in the streets in Blade Runner. October 6, 2017. This morning, I got up from a pretty crazy lucid dream. I found myself in a swanky room like a parlor. There was a bar in the center of the room, and I saw a blonde-haired man wearing black sitting there having a drink. He looked up at me, stood up, took his blonde hair off, revealing that he was bald, and stretched out really tall and thin, becoming bone white. He then threw a sash or smock of sorts over his shoulder, and it cascaded down his body, reaching down to his knees. It was black with very thin horizontal orange lines running down it. Getting a better look at his face, I saw that it was inhuman and a bit frightening, sort of like a puppet in an indie European film. Actually, kind of, but not entirely, somewhat resembled the face of that mask in the Scream series of movies. Not exactly at all, like just somewhat like that. It had a kind of mournful look to it. I remember asking it who it was, and it just glared at me, began coming at me aggressively. I put my hands up and began casting magical shields and wards at him, swiping him away from me. He would disappear, and then reappear somewhere else, coming at me furiously again. I remember him slashing his arm at me, and he had claws on his fingers. I decided that I should really just leave the guy alone, also a bit scared that he may hurt me, so I woke myself up. March 13th, 2018. Wow. Just woke up from some unbelievable lucid dreams. The first place I was in was a city, which I came to understand was in China. It was atmospherically foggy, in that it wasn't general pea soup fog that enveloped everything. It was thick in certain places and absent in most others. The city was surrounded by those uniquely Asian, beautiful rounded mountains. It had many inclines with very long stairways. I wandered around some outdoor markets. There were strange, towering, futuristic buildings I can't describe. The sky had a yellowish cast to it and was cloudy. My father appeared when I was looking at the sky and commented that the sky is more yellow and blue here than it is in America. I also saw hot air balloons up in the sky. The strangest thing by far about this place is that there were many ropes or chains hanging down from the sky somehow. I never saw what they were suspended from. At the bottom of each of them was a net filled with rocks or stone slabs just hanging there in the air over the city. They filled the sky. I woke up and went back to sleep, hoping to go back to the same place, but I wound up somewhere else. I should note that I have woken up, sometimes for over an hour, then gone back to sleep and returned to the exact same place I had been before in a dream, so that's not unheard of for me. I found myself in what seemed like an abandoned room which used to be a bar of some sort. Everything was polished dark wood, but was in shambles. Suddenly a zombie guy came at me and I smashed something into his head and ran. He stumbled into me and I noticed that his head was gone, so I just shoved him aside and jumped onto a cappuccino machine, which I tipped over and then jumped off of to then supernaturally zip down a series of stairs. I then found myself in a smaller bar where people were talking and gambling was going on. Two men were playing some kind of a game. There were these strange golden half spheres covered in little divots, which seemed to be the equivalent of gambling chips. The men were deeply involved in an argument and were not paying attention to these objects, so, knowing it was a dream, I mischievously grabbed one of the golden objects and made for the exit. One of the men noticed and started pursuing me, yelling at me. It was really funny because, as he followed me out the front doors, he bumped into me a little bit and said, "Oh, sorry, excuse me," as if his leaving the building, outside of normal dream script since I was lucidly breaking the rules, made him completely forget about my theft. I threw the object to the ground and looked around, thinking I must be back in the same Chinese city. The first thing I saw outside was a normal, tall, modern city building. Then I turned and saw an absolutely gigantic crane. At first I thought that part of it was missing, but then I saw that it was just very strangely shaped. It didn't have a normal central part. It was built in a very strange manner, like a curving arc around empty space. It had many intricate parts to it and looked very sci-fi. I speculated that maybe it was one of the things which were suspending the hanging ropes with the stones from before. I then turned a corner and was absolutely astonished by what I saw. There is no way that I can convey the complexity and intricacy of it. It was an extremely futuristic series of structures I can hardly even call buildings. One looked like a massive robotic arm of some kind and was stunning in its beautiful robotic complexity. It was reminiscent of the Chris Cunningham video for Bjork's All Is Full of Love. Just stunningly beautiful futuristic sci-fi wonder beyond description. I then saw a gigantic pyramid-type structure, though it was rounded. It didn't have edges like a pyramid. It was like a very large squat cone, the apex of which joined with a similar structure above which mirrored it. Where they met, there was a brilliant blue light, and it was just beautiful. Blue-white light cascaded down the sides of the lower pyramid in gorgeous patterns. I actually began crying uncontrollably, just because it was so goddamn beautiful. I just couldn't believe it. Then I woke up and here I am, back in Normalsville. March 20th, 2018. This time, I was in city streets with lots of signs, lights, and lit-up storefronts like a trendy downtown area. I remember going into a bright sushi restaurant to sample the foods on the tables. Though none of it was sushi, strangely enough, and it tasted rather unremarkable, and was all things I've never seen in the waking world. Now, as a side note, I have tasted things in certain lucid dreams, and have tasted them. A dream I had more recently, I remember eating fried chicken, and being surprised by how much it tasted like fried chicken, and how awesome it was I was able to eat fried chicken without any consequences to my health. The restaurant was very long and narrow with glass walls, kind of like a diner or Waffle House. There was three-dimensional signage over the place, which was a big representation of a shrimp over rice. That kind of sashimi. I also wandered around a place that was a sort of combination hotel mall that seemed like a casino. I noticed that, as usual lucid dreams, every time I looked away from something and then looked back at it again, it would change. So I decided to do an experiment. I sat down at a table next to a guy and looked at him. Then I closed my eyes and opened them again. His face had changed, but he was still the same basic build and his hair was the same color. I closed my eyes and opened them again and the same facial change occurred. I then blinked my eyes over and over again very fast, and his face went through constant changes like someone flipping quickly through slides on a film projector. I don't know exactly what this says about dreams and perception, but it is very fascinating. And now, the news.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
A man says he saw a Bigfoot-like creature in Western Canada as it was beamed up by what he described as a UFO. The anonymous 60-year-old man claimed he was hunting in an undisclosed wooded area of British Columbia on October 31st when the incident occurred. "I sat to wait for game. Just before dark, a Sasquatch entered the cut block, went to the middle and stopped," he said. As he observed the creature, the Canadian says a large black shape suddenly showed up. "Before I could move or think, it shone a light on it and both disappeared," he explains, adding that the event blew his mind and left him wondering whether the cryptid primates could actually be some kind of UFO scout or explorers. He did not present photographic evidence nor further details regarding the physical characteristics of the purported biped. A paranormal school of thought proposes the interdimensional hypothesis, which suggests these visitations could be part of entities traveling through different layers of reality or dimensions. A woman in Callaway County, Kentucky, says she saw a pink, pig-like bipedal animal about 11 miles from the town of Murray. Kentuckian Patty reports she was on her way home, driving on Highway 94 when she spotted the creature in plain daylight. "I was in my little red Mercury Bobcat, and I saw a tall, slender creature on the side of the road," she told Thomas Markham about the 1983 encounter. Patty claims the unidentified animal had just jumped out of a field crop just 50 feet away from her vehicle, running across the road like a gorilla. It was using its arms and legs, headed into the marsh-type land going towards Kentucky Lake. She says she got out of the car and hollered at it. The animal then stopped, turned around, and began looking straight at her. Reportedly, as fear sank in, she headed back to her vehicle and locked its doors. I waited a few minutes while the creature was still visible. This was rush hour, but the odd thing is that there were no vehicles in sight, she recalls. So, she says, hoping somebody would come along, she waited a little longer. I could flag them down and they could see the creature too. Patty described the creature as a 7-foot-tall hairless animal with a pink skin, long torso and arms, hands similar to that of a human and short legs. And it held a small head with small pointy ears. She said its face hosted intelligent eyes and a pig-like snout. She believes the being was a young one and that it reminded her of a teenager, mischievous but not harmful. I would describe it as a cross between a primate, a pig, and a human, she said. As soon as she got home, Patty told her husband about the odd encounter, but he didn't take her seriously. He thought I was crazy, but I know what I saw, Patty said. Markham thinks the animal could have been a dogman, a cryptid reputed to live in the northwestern quadrant of Michigan's Lower Peninsula, although other sightings have been reported in different locations, such as Kentucky. A New York resident on Monday said he spotted a humanoid with a wolf head. The 16-year-old witness, a Native American from Oneida, who provided his identity but was kept anonymous as per the standard code of journalism ethics regarding disclosure of the identity of a minor, he told Cryptozoology News that he was on his neighbor's property looking for wild berries in the summer of 2017 when he encountered the creature at around 4:30 p.m. I had found some berries and was picking through them when what sounded like several branches broke nearby, so I went to investigate the noise. The boy says he observed the creature clearly, then decided to run away. I didn't think anymore. I started walking up the hill slowly. I heard it approaching me, so I ran as fast as I could. I reached my neighbor's open cornfield, and that's when I believe it stopped its pursuit. The student described the animal as a 7-foot-tall humanoid with white and gray fur on its cheeks, hands, and neck. It had bright blue eyes, glowing. It looked more human than wolf. I noticed it had claws about 2 to 3 inches long, he said. He added that he and his family have also spotted UFOs every now and then in the area. Being Native American, you hear stories of men with the ability to shift into any animal, but this thing scared me. I haven't been back to that trail ever since. I haven't told the story to anyone. Early on the bitterly cold morning of January 4th, 1979, in the small town just west of Birmingham, England, Jean Hingley stood in her garden door, waving goodbye to her husband as he left for work. On her way back inside, she noticed a large orange sphere hovering close to the roof of the garage. Heat emanated from the object. Suddenly, her dog became stiff and flopped over sideways. At that moment, 3 small figures slipped through the doorway into the house, making a ZZZ sound. Hingley headed toward the living room when she heard the Christmas tree rattling, only to find 2 of the beings shaking it. The beings were 3.5 feet tall and had large oval wings that looked as if they were made of thin paper and were covered with glittering braille dots. Sparkling eyes like black diamonds were set wide on their white faces, which otherwise bore but the slightest hint of a nose and just a line for a mouth. Their heads were covered by helmets like goldfish bowls, atop of which were set small lights. The beings had no apparent hands or feet, their appendages ending in simple tapered points. They were dressed in silver tunics with 6 silver buttons down the front and numerous thin streamers hanging down from the shoulders. The beings flew about and hovered with arms clasped over their chests and their legs hanging down stiffly. Hingley felt paralyzed at times during the hour-long encounter. When she was able to speak to them, they replied in unison in a gruff masculine voice. The beings pressed the buttons on their tunics before they spoke. When she asked where they were from, they flew around the room and landed on the sofa where they began jumping up and down like children. When she told them to stop, the lights at the top of their helmets focused a very thin laser-like beam on her forehead that burned and occasionally blinded her. They disabled Hingley with the beam several times over the course of the encounter, seemingly whenever they were unable to perform tasks like drinking the water, eating the mince pie she offered them, or answering questions. At one point, the beings floated around the room, picking up and putting down cassette tapes and other things. It was as if the pointed ends of their arms were magnetic. Finally, the beings sailed out the back door, which had remained open the whole time, and into their spaceship, which measured 8 feet long and 4 feet high. It had glowing portholes around it and a scorpion-like tail at the back with an aerial wheel on top. The object took off and headed north. Immediately afterward, Hingley fell to the carpet in pain and only later was able to call her husband, her neighbors, and the police. An examination of the landing spot in the snow-covered garden revealed 2 parallel lines, each an inch wide, traversed by a series of lines like a caterpillar track. Her clock, TV, and radio ceased to work properly, and the cassette tapes the beings had handled were distorted and ruined. Hingley had sore eyes for a week after the encounter and a red mark on her forehead that persisted for months. On October 4, 1954, in Lézignan, France, André Garcia and André Dorzet were driving a truck between La Grasse and Villemont when they saw a luminous object coming slowly to the ground. It measured about 10 meters diameter and took off with a burst of light. On October 4, 1954, in Chalix, France, a farmer, Mr. Guéraud, saw an object the size of a carriage land in his field. 2 men of normal height emerged through a sliding door. They wore khaki overalls and were of European type. They shook hands with the witness and said something like, "Paris? Nord?" According to another version, they spoke indistinct words. They gave a pat on the back to Mr. Guéraud's dog and took off at an amazing speed. On October 4th, 1954 in the evening, in Trégon, France, several people noticed an object hovering near a hilltop. They drove to the site, but it flew away. What seems to be the same object was seen at Migrit, 25 kilometers to the southwest, hovering over a farm. It was described as metallic, flat, emitting light. On October 4th, 1954, at 1830 hours, at Monceau-les-Mines, France, at Les Chavans, about 20 people, among them Remy Gaudicourt of Savines, saw a circular, luminous object rise from the vicinity of the railroad tracks. It took off vertically. On October 4th, 1954, at 1840 hours, in Villers-les-Tilleuls, France, 10-year-old Bertau saw an object like a tent and an unknown man near it. On October 4th, 1954, at 2000 hours, in Poncé-sur-Lignon, France, Mrs. Fourneret, a housewife, ran away as an orange circular object 3 meters in diameter swung in midair and landed near her farm. When Messieurs Giraudeau and Vincent arrived with rifles, they found that the earth had been sucked up over a quadrilateral area. François Boulier confirmed he had seen a luminous object in flight. Extensive investigation by French Air Force and police. Now returning to strange occurrences in Ireland. In County Mayo, at Shrahinsloch, Achill Island, sightings of lake monster on 1st May 1968 at night. 2 men saw it run across the road and said it was 8 to 10 feet long. A week later, a boy cycling by the lake saw a large black creature crawling out of water. In County Roscommon, in Lough Ree, 3 priests saw a long-necked monster swimming 100 yards away, 18th May 1960. In County Tipperary, in Templemore, all the statues and holy pictures in a home where there was a 16-year-old boy began to bleed. Also, poltergeist phenomena centered on the boy, beginning 21st of August 1920. In County Waterford, at Melloray, Cappoquin, people visiting the grotto saw a statue of Virgin Mary come to life. She gave messages, began 16th August 1985. In County Wexford, at Cahor Point, long-necked sea monster seen, which moved like a big worm, 23rd January 1976. In Enniscorthy, poltergeist outbreak with wrappings and movement of bedclothes, 7th of July to 29th of July 1910. At Hookhead, sightings by fishermen of huge lizard-like monster with long neck and humped back, at least 20 feet long, 1975. At County Wicklow, in Lough Ray, lake monster seen, 1963. Now going to Italy, in the Adriatic Sea, fishermen were seeing strange columns of water about 100 feet high, and long, dark objects emerging and submerging, October 1978. In Ancona, poltergeist outbreak, December 1907 to January 1908. At Assisi, crowd saw statue of Blessed Virgin Mary move, 11 February 1948. At Atrapalda, Avellino, photograph of face of turned shroud streamed with blood, began December 1958. In Aversa, shower of stones rained on a garage, early 1981. At Boreria, Rovigo, egg-shaped UFO flew over farm emitting blast of light. Cows panicked, farmer fainted, pond was dried up, and haystacks caught fire. Cattle were burnt. 15th October 1954. In Brescia, farmer found 4 huge chickens' footprints, June 1985. At Cape Masulo, at the island of Capri, artists saw UFO land and 4 small entities in coveralls emerge. They stayed outside for half an hour before leaving, 17th October 1954. Now, at the Caserta, Avellino, and Potenza areas, long, hair-covered, 6-foot monster with bright eyes and large ears seen. It was seen in the mountains and sometimes in conjunction with low-level lights, May and June 1986.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
That was a public service announcement designed to scare the shit out.
He was abducted by aliens earlier this afternoon. That little girl got lost under the bed and she went into an alternate dimension.
I'm going to read the entry, The Hexem Heads, from the book The Illustrated History of the Haunted World by Jason Karl. The strange case of the Hexem Heads begins in February 1972, when 2 young children playing in their garden in Hexham, Northumberland, stumbled across 2 apparently ancient relics amongst the undergrowth. Upon examination, they appeared to be 2 carved stone heads, each a little smaller than tennis balls. One had a distinctly skull-like male appearance, and the other, slightly smaller head, displayed a more feminine face. Both had uneasy expressions that exuded a peculiar melancholy. The heads were crudely finished with hollow eyes and protruding noses, and were taken at once into the family home, where they were proudly displayed as curiosities. It was soon after they had been welcomed into the house that they began to take on a life of their own. The family first witnessed that they moved of their own accord, turning from where they had been placed to watch a different area of the house. Household items were found inexplicably broken, and a bed was discovered strewn with broken glass from an unknown origin. The apparent power exuding from the eerie relics was not confined to the house in which they were visiting, as the next-door neighbors found out a few days later. It was late at night when the mother of the house was awoken from her sleep by her young daughter, who was in terrible pain from a toothache and needed comforting from her mother. It was while they were talking that the power of the heads momentarily came into their lives with an incredible encounter with what they described as a werewolf. Both mother and daughter heard a sound on the landing, and as they strained their eyes in the gloom, they both watched as a half-man, half-beast crossed the threshold. Frightened for their lives, they screamed out in terror, at which point the father came running into the room, but he was too late to witness the manifestation as it had already bounded down the staircase to the floor below. All three stood in silence as the man-beast could be heard padding around before the house became silent and normality returned. The front door had been unlocked, and they assumed that this extraordinary creature had left by that means, never to return again. Following this remarkable encounter with what appeared to be a cryptozoological marvel, the heads were given to a Southampton-based historian of Celtic culture. No doubt the family was glad to be rid of them, hoping their lives, which had been temporarily touched by the supernatural world, would return to normal. According to the accounts of this bizarre tale, the historian declared that the heads were indeed of Celtic origin and resembled similar finds that she had collected from other sources. She dated them at over 1,800 years old. She had been given no details pertaining to the weird phenomenon that seemed to be caused by the presence of the heads, which is why her own report is of great interest. Several nights after taking possession of the heads and adding them to her existing collection, she was disturbed in the night by the presence of what she described as a half-man, half-animal standing in the doorway of her bedroom. She said it was about 6 feet high, slightly stooping, and it was black against the white door. It was half-man, half-animal, the upper part being that of a wolf and the lower of a man. It was covered in a very dark fur. As the creature disappeared out of the bedroom, the historian leapt from her bed, compelled to follow it. She earnestly pursued the creature as it descended the staircase and departed from the house. Following this first encounter, the werewolf appeared several more times and was seen by other members of her family, often on the staircase, where on one occasion it jumped over the banister and landed in the hall. Other phenomena which had not begun until the heads had entered the building included the anomalous slamming of doors and the sound of the beast padding about, although no visual manifestation accompanied the sound. It was thought that the Hexem Heads were responsible for causing the plethora of sinister encounters, and it was decided that they should be removed from the building, along with the historian's entire collection. Soon afterwards, the Hexem Heads passed into the hands of another collector whose identity and current whereabouts are unknown. Did the power of the heads only have a limited lifespan, or is the beastly guardian still guarding these ugly carvings? Have we seen the last of this gruesome twosome? Or will they rear their ugly heads once more?
Time has come to see the world as it is.
I'm going to read another chapter from the book Does It Rain in Other Dimensions by Mike Oram. This chapter is called The Floating City and the Biomechanical Being. For over 25 years now, I have been taken in the middle of the night, usually between the hours of 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. It does, however, also occur in the daytime as well, but not as frequently. I know when it is going to happen and I prepare myself for the experience. I will get a feeling, a knowing in my head, either minutes, hours, or even up to 2 days before the event. If I have only a few minutes warning, then I will immediately sit down in my recliner, tune in, and wait. If I have just retired to bed and feel that the experience is imminent, I will then lie back on the pillow and focus my mind on what is about to take place. Shortly after that, I will become aware of a presence and a buzzing sound will start in my head and move down through my body. This vibration through my body builds up and reaches a crescendo, and at that point I simply lift off and go straight through the ceiling or closed window. I love this incredible vibrational change and liftoff, and if it has not happened for a while, I actually miss it. I have been told that this process is to change the frequency of my body, and this allows me to then pass through a closed window or ceiling. The actual liftoff and feeling of weightlessness is a very pleasant experience. The liftoff is quite gradual, and the break in consciousness usually takes place once I have arrived on the craft and remains that way until it is time for me to return, although there have been many experiences where I have been allowed to remember much more than this. There is normally enough of the experience in my conscious mind to make me aware that something has happened, and then that can be looked into at a later time, under regression. Whether this is arranged by them, or whether it is coincidental, I do not know, but I rather favor the first option. I have a feeling that enough of the experience is left available to the conscious mind so we can then make our own conscious decision to look into the matter further, if we choose to do so. This is how we grow as spiritual beings and also become closer to our galactic family, and they, of course, then remain working within universal law. Although I mentioned earlier that the takeoff is usually gradual, there was an experience back in 1990 that literally took my breath away. I was now living in the Lake District in the north of England with my then girlfriend Karen. It was New Year's Eve, and we had gone to Karen's parents for the festivities. Karen's brother and his wife were also there, having driven up from Norfolk the day before. The evening went well, with a game of charades and some quizzes, and we retired about 2 a.m. We were all up by 10 a.m. the following morning and had a main meal at midday. We then waved goodbye to Karen's brother and his wife as they set off to make their way back south. Karen's parents lived in a delightful detached house in a small quaint village. They had 2 living rooms at opposite ends of the house, one for Karen's mother, so she could play the piano and listen to her classical music, and the other for her father, so he could enjoy watching his sports on television. Karen and her mother retired to one of these rooms to watch a film on television while her father and I occupied the other. A log fire was crackling away, giving the room a cozy feel, and we were engaged in a discussion. Karen's father was a very polite man, and if he were about to leave the room, for whatever reason, he would excuse himself and tell me where he was going. We were partway through conversation when suddenly, without any warning, he stood up and left the room. I was very surprised at this, and almost felt a little shocked, as this was out of character. I thought about it for a moment, then just rested my head back into the armchair and closed my eyes. Almost immediately, without any warning, the buzzing started in my head and coursed through my body in an instant, and I shot up through the ceiling at the most amazing speed. I felt the change in temperature instantly, as I left the warmth of that cozy living room and was propelled into the cold air of the January day. I was traveling up into the sky so fast that I could feel the G-force on my face. My skin contorted and stretched back as I moved through the air at lightning speed. I could feel hands on top of my hands as they were resting on the arms of the chair. This had puzzled me for years, until the regression sessions in 2005, as I actually felt that the armchair had gone with me. I also felt hands on the tops of my shoulders. When I was way up in the sky, the upward movement stopped. I then went along horizontally at the same breakneck speed. I passed over a pine forest and, with heightened senses, I breathed in the strong aroma of pine, then over some hills and another pine forest with the same strong smell. Speedily, I arrived at the coastline of eastern England and carried on out to sea. I eventually stopped and could see, way below, the glittering water. I moved forward a little more and saw below me a huge round object. It was a tremendous size, and in the center of it was an opening that was circular and flooded with the most intense white light. I descended into this light and immediately felt the change of temperature as I was once again out of the cold January air. I landed on a solid floor, and the hands that had been on my shoulders and the hands that had been resting on top of my own hands were released. I cannot begin to tell you how incredibly excited I was about all this, and felt that, at last, I would be fully aware of what was happening when, the next thing I remember, was being lowered back down into the living room of Karen's parents' home. I was bitterly disappointed, but quickly pulled myself together and stood up. My shirt, for some unknown reason, was soaked in sweat. I ran through the house and into the other living room in time to see all three of them in suspended animation. Karen's father was sitting on the arm of the armchair while Karen and her mother were still on the couch. A few seconds later, they suddenly animated and came back to life, and I called to Karen to come and listen to what I had to tell her. I asked Karen's father why he suddenly left the room, but he never really gave a clear-cut answer. None of them believed me, of course, and for years I found this whole episode utterly frustrating. This was one of the experiences I wanted to look at when David Coggins came to stay at my home in July 2005 to conduct a series of regressions. Once in a relaxed state, I was taken back to the time when I shot off through the ceiling at breakneck speed. Karen's father had just left the room. The buzzing flooded through my body and I found myself in the sky. Once again I traveled over the pine forests, over the hills, and out to sea. Below me was the huge round object with a circular opening that was flooded with light. I was lowered into this light and landed on what seemed to be a long balcony. When I say long, I mean very long. It had a metal balustrade on the right-hand side, and on the left were doors and other corridors. One door was open, and there seemed to be a reason for that. I do believe that something went on in that room that was connected to me, but for some reason we never explored that part of the experience. I looked over the balustrade, and way below me was a massive hangar. There were V-shaped craft and round saucers of different sizes that were either static on the floor or hovering and moving around this cavernous area. A voice in my head told me that this was a floating city, and that it contained many different races from other systems that were in alliance with each other. They were what you might call a galactic alliance. I had been here before. I recognized it. The doors, the hangar, the balustrade, in fact all of it. A voice again spoke to me and told me to move along the corridor. I walked along and occasionally looked over the balustrade to view the strange craft below. Eventually, in front of me in the distance, I saw what looked like a camera iris and a lens at the end of the wall. It seemed to be an airtight door, perhaps leading to outside, but I was really not sure. What had more impact on my mind was the tall, biomechanical being that was standing at the end of this corridor. To call him a robot would have been an insult. This was a highly intelligent being that could think and reason and also seemed to have feelings. I knew this person because that is exactly what he seemed to be, a person. He seemed to be no different than you and I, yet much more intelligent. He must have been 15 feet tall and highly complex. There was a type of chair in his chest cavity, and I knew that I had to sit in it. I also knew that I had sat in this very chair several times before. He bent his knees, and that allowed me to sit in the chair. 3 metal strips wrapped around each side of my body and closed onto my chest. This was not a negative thing. It was just to stop me from literally falling out once he stood up. There was a very thin wire that came around the right-hand side of my head and seemed to enter my temple. I knew instantly that this was a health check, and I had the utmost faith in this wonderful being. It was almost like meeting an old friend that you had not seen for a while, and, however strange this may sound, he seemed like a friend of the family. Why this health check was carried out, I am not sure, and this was not looked at any further under regression, but it is something I would like to look into at another time. I think the half-memory of this chair led to my believing for years that I had actually left the living room still sitting in the armchair. Telos has told me in the past that they stitch together experiences so as to cause us the least stress and impact in this life. He said that we may think we can deal with all this and easily amalgamate it into our conscious reality here on Earth, but it is far harder than we realize. They live within universal laws, and one of those laws is about interfering with evolution on other planets. So they try and work behind the scenes to change or raise our consciousness in the hope of giving us a greater understanding of who they are and who we are. They try to work with us by creating the least impact on our lives as possible. After about 10 minutes, the checkup seemed to be over and the thin wire retracted from my right temple. Then this wonderful biomechanical being bent his knees again, and the 3 strips of metal that covered both sides of my chest retracted. I then slid off the chair and onto the ground. I turned around and looked up at this amazing being and smiled. He looked down and somehow sent thoughts or feelings into my head that he was pleased to see me again and hoped that I was coping well back on Earth. I then heard another voice in my head. It told me to walk back along the corridor. I felt sad at saying goodbye to the biomechanical being, but somehow knew that we would be meeting again. I turned around and started to walk back along the long corridor and once again found myself stopping and looking over the balustrade at the spectacular sight below. The huge V-shaped craft that were parked and the smaller disc-shaped vehicles coming in to land or lifting off and making their way along the vast hangar to exit on who knows what journey. My mind was just flooded with all sorts of wonders. Where had these craft been? Where were they departing? Why have we not been told by our governments that such wonders are taking place right under our very noses? Scientists theorize about the possible chances of finding other life in the universe or speculate on the possibility of other life when they detect another planet umpteen light years away that may have the right conditions to support life. Yet here on Earth there are tens of thousands of people who are actually having contact on a daily basis, and they fail to take an interest. Am I missing something here? I continued along to the edge of the corridor and noticed a man waiting there for me. As I got closer, I once again recognized Telos, my dear space brother. He seemed to pop up everywhere in my life, and now I find him on this floating city. I was so pleased to see him again, and we shook hands. A flood of energy shot through my being, and for a while it made me feel quite inadequate because I am sure that my energy did not flood through him in the same way. He must have read my thoughts because he instantly smiled and impressed on my mind that I was not to underestimate myself. This energy exchange is, he said, a two-way thing, and he was as pleased as I was that this meeting was taking place. He then led me through one of the many doors that were placed along the balcony, and as I stepped inside, I started to feel a little faint, and the air felt heavier. He then led me through one of the many doors that were placed along the balcony, and as soon as I stepped inside, I started to feel a little faint, and the air felt heavier. The buzzing started in my head, and in no time at all, I was back outside and hovering over the sea. At great speed, I then headed for the coastline and inland, over the pine forests, over the hills, back to the small village where Karen's parents lived. I looked down below and recognized the top of the house, and instantly found myself back in the armchair. The hands that were once again on top of my hands and shoulders immediately lifted, and after a few seconds, I opened my eyes and looked around the room slightly disoriented. In October 2005, I gave a talk at the Probe conference in Blackpool, and this gave me the opportunity to openly discuss some of these experiences for the first time. I had made some 35mm transparencies of the technically good and uncannily accurate drawings that John Pickering did for my book, and these were shown also. I projected onto the screen the symbols, magnetic pulse generator, biomechanical being, etc. The talk went well, was generously applauded, and seemed to be successful. At the start of the lecture, a stepladder, that was leaning against the wall near me, decided at that point to leave the wall and suddenly topple forward, crashing onto the floor. I turned around and thanked whoever it was that was late turning up from another dimension, and then rushed knocked over the ladder. This was, of course, a joke, and brought laughter from the audience and helped to settle people in. Also during that day, while sitting listening to other lectures, my right leg was repeatedly poked and tugged at. As Fran and I were on 2 chairs right at the back of the room, separate from the main audience, there was no one around to do this. Whilst in the speaker's room, at lunchtime, Fran was pushed so hard in the small of the back that she lurched forward and fell out of her shoes. This was witnessed by those present, including the organizers of the conference, and again, there was no one behind her to do this. A conference attendee, an old friend of mine who had experienced the early days in Warminster, as I had, asked for permission to videotape my lecture and slideshow, and I was only too pleased to let him make a recording. He told me after my talk had finished that he had charged his batteries up to full charge the preceding evening, and to make sure that they were fully charged, he said he continued to charge them for another couple of hours. They should have lasted for almost 3 hours, he told me later. He was looking through the viewfinder of his camera while recording my talk and could see in the top right-hand corner of the screen that the batteries were fully charged, but as soon as I put the symbols the light beings gave me onto the projector screen, the batteries drained in an instant. He said that 1 second they were showing full charge, and the next second they were drained and the camera immediately shut down, and so he failed to capture the symbols in the recording. Up to that point, my talk had lasted for 45 minutes, so he should have had plenty of battery life left. He told me later that he had never experienced such a thing before. After the talk, a lady approached me, quite excitedly, and told me that she had also met this biomechanical being and had also sat in the chair. I was amazed to hear this and so pleased to get that confirmation. I was at conflict in my mind whether to mention this being at all because of the strangeness factor, and only decided a couple of days before to go ahead and tell all. I am glad that I did so, and this also goes to show that we must be brave with this stuff, because however weird some of this may sound, it is still important to get the information out there into the public domain. We are dealing with very advanced alien races from other star systems, galaxies, and dimensions, and some of their technology is going to be so way in advance of our own that it may well be beyond our comprehension. Today's accepted knowledge was often someone's crackpot idea to yesterday's men of learning. Scientists today still make such wild assumptions based on limited vision and faulty foundations. These faulty foundations hold up their entire life's work, and it would be financially and personally disastrous if someone were to take out one of the bricks from the bottom of the pack. If a UFO experiencer or visitor contactee appeared on a television program with one of these scientists or psychologists, they would be pulled to pieces simply because the subject is so open to ridicule, and most people would prefer to believe the person who has degrees and letters after his or her name. Look what they did to Galileo, yet he was right. So when we decided to bare our souls on stage and talk about these new aspects of reality, we must not end up basing our decision to do so on whether the public will think we are mad or not, because we may miss confirming for another that their experience is real and valid. If I had decided to not mention the biomechanical being, then I would not have received confirmation from that lady about her experience with possibly the same being or one like it. 1 month later, Fran and I went to Lincolnshire to stay with friends whose son had alien contact all his life and claims to be an indigo child. He had been giving a talk in San Francisco only the week before, and after the talk, a man from the audience came to speak to him and, to my friend's surprise, mentioned this biomechanical being and told my friend that he had also sat in the chair. The third strange anomaly to happen in relation to this biomechanical being was the following. When John Pickering was ready to draw this being, I went to his home to sit with him and describe how this unusual being looked, as it was quite complex, and I was worried that John may come up against problems depicting what was, to our eyes, quite bizarre. I had no need to worry. John immediately started drawing at breakneck speed. The image was quickly forming right in front of my eyes. I turned to John and asked him how he knew what to draw, as I had not yet explained it to that degree. John looked round, smiled, then turned back to the sheet of paper and continued. It was taking shape fast, and he started to put in the thin wire that came around the right side of my head and entered my temple before I had even told him about this. I then noticed an odd thing happening. He began to rub the top of his head really hard, as if something was irritating him. I asked him what was wrong, but he said nothing. He was okay. I then asked him again how he could draw this being so well when I had not properly explained it to him, and again he just smiled and continued to rub the top of his head. I then said ferbally, "John, do you know this being? Have you seen him before?" He did not answer, so I pushed the question at him once more, only this time even more firmly. He turned towards me and said that he had seen both the being and the chair before, but would say no more about it. He continued to rub his head until the drawing was finished, and then no more was said about it, and shortly after that I drove back home. I found out the following morning, through his partner, that a large, round lump had appeared on top of his head, as big as a large marble. His partner had told him that, if it was still there the following morning, she would take him to the hospital, but in the morning it had completely disappeared. Whether this was a psychosomatic condition or not, I do not know, and John was reluctant to talk more about it, as he usually is with these matters. What all this means I have no way of knowing, but in this elusive subject, confirmation is a wonderful thing, and the more people that are brave enough to stand up and tell their stories, the better it will be for all of us.
Time has come to see the world as it is.
Alright, I'm going to read some excerpts from DMT, the Spirit Molecule, by Rick Straussman, and I'm just going to read the accounts of what the experiment subjects saw when they were on high doses of DMT. There were spirals of what looked like DNA, red and green. The visuals were dropping back into tubes, like protozoa, like the inside of a cell, seeing the DNA twirling and spiraling. They looked like gelatin-like tubes, inside which were cellular activities. It was like a microscopic view of them. There was a spiral DNA type thing made out of incredibly bright cubes. I felt the boxes at the same time that my consciousness shifted. I felt the DMT release my soul's energy and push it through the DNA. It's what happened when I lost my body. There were spirals that reminded me of things I've seen at Chaco Canyon. Maybe that was DNA. Maybe the ancients knew that. The DNA is backed into the universe like space travel. One needs to travel without one's body. It's ridiculous to think about space travel in little ships. There were visuals at the peak, soft and geometric. They were 3D circles and cones with shading. They moved a lot. It was almost like looking at an alphabet, but it wasn't English. It was like a fantasy alphabet, a cross between runes and Russian or Arabic writing. It felt like there was some information in it, like it was data. It wasn't just random. It's like seeing panels with a cutout shape, rounded edges, hieroglyphics of some sort. They weren't painted on, but more cut out, through which I saw the colors. There was a woman speaking Spanish all the time throughout the trip. She had quite a unique accent. Maybe it wasn't Spanish, but it sounded like it. At one point she said regular. She threw a white blanket over the scene and then pulled it back repeatedly. It was really weird. There were numbers. It was like numerology and language. There were all these colors, and then there were all these numbers, Roman numerals. The numbers became words. Where do words come from? The woman would cover them with her blanket, the words and the numbers. It started out typically as DMT, but then I went past it, beyond where I've been on DMT. There was that ringing sound as you're getting up there, and then I went to the language or number thing. It was totally inexplicable. Maybe it was trying to teach me something. The first number I saw was a 2, and I looked around, and there were numbers all around. They were separate in their little boxes, and then the boxes would melt, and the numbers would all merge together to make long numbers. What's interesting is that I began experiencing sets of hallucinations, and then I said to myself, this is the logos. There's the blue-yellow core of meaning and semantics, basically. It's like threads of words or DNA or something. They're all around there. They're everywhere. After the blue amoebic shapes, there were several pulsating places. I thought, there are lots of these. It's a good feeling. Then it breaks into a ruffled reality. When I looked around, it seemed like the meaning or symbols were there. Some kind of core of reality where all meaning is stored. I burst into its main chamber. I don't know if it's because of my interest in computers or not, but it seems like it's the raw bits of reality. It's a lot more than only the ones and zeros. It's a higher level, very potent bits. I was in a white room, experiencing certain emotions and feelings that gave me an intense feeling of being a co-reality. Like a dream I had of bumping into some Hispanic kids with my car, into their car. They were really mad at me. I said to them, if you hate me, you hate yourself. Our cultures are merged, so there's no defending against that. Their culture, our culture, they were co-real, existing simultaneously. The white room consisted mostly of light and space. There were cubes stacked with icons on the surfaces, like a logos of consciousness. It was light, but there was a lot of other information coming in. There were some scenes or forms like in a nursery. No babies, but there were cribs and different animals, vibrant. I went to a childhood scene or feeling. It was like I was in a stroller, kid images. It was sort of scary. I can't describe it. I could draw it, maybe. It was like being in a room as a child with a stroller. There were cartoon-like people in the room, but they weren't what I wanted to see. There are no doors. There's nothing to go through. It's either over here, it's dark, or over there are images. You just can't do anything with them. It was Mayan hieroglyphics. It was interesting. The hieroglyphics turned into a room, like I was a child. There were toys there, like I was a kid. It was like that. It was cute. It was a scene of apartments from the future, like living quarters. They were gorgeous. Pink, orange, those kinds of colors, yellow, real bright. The places to sit, do things, the counters, they were molded out of the walls. I've never seen anything like it. It was really modern looking. The almost organic nature of the apartment was beautiful. It wasn't just functional. There was life in the furniture, like it was molded out of something alive, an animal, a living being. I felt in awe of the apartments, an artistic appreciation, like looking out at a beautiful painting and getting lost in it, lost in the happiness. At the end I went past beyond the apartments. I entered into a space, a crack in the earth. It wasn't horizontal, it was vertical, a crack in space. There was no turning back. After a moment or two, I became aware of something happening to my left. I saw a psychedelic day-glow-colored space that approximated a room whose walls and floor had no clear separations or edges. It was throbbing, pulsing electrically. Rising in front of me was a podium-like table. It seemed that some presence was dealing or serving something to me. I wanted to know where I was and sensed the reply that I had no business there. The presence was not hostile, just someone annoyed and brusque. The relentless, scratchy, crackling visuals didn't last long. Then I was above a strange landscape, like Earth, but very unearthly. Mountains of some sort. It was very friendly and inviting. It was so real I had to open my eyes. When I did, the scene was overlaid on top of the room. I closed my eyes and that removed the interference with what I had been seeing. It was like a super bright day-glow poster, but much more complex. I was hovering miles above it. I had the very distinct sense of doing this, not just the visual perception. There were some telescopes or microwave dishes or water tower things with antennae on them. I wish I could take you by the hand and show you. A vast expanse of horizon. The sun was different colors and hues than our sun. Oh yeah, there were people and guides. I was with a Mexican family on a porch of a house in the desert. There was a garden scene outside. There were kids and stuff. I was playing with the kids. I was part of the family. I had a sense of an old man standing behind me or around me someplace. I wanted to talk with him, but he let me know somehow that it was more important to visit with the young girl. It was pretty laid back, benign. It seemed so natural and complete as it was happening. It wasn't a dream at all. I thought, it seems like a pretty common day, and then I stopped and thought, no, I'm tripping. There were some black people too, sort of pulling at me. There was a curious feeling of being extracted. It was a jarring feeling. I was being called away. I saw such strange dreams, but at the beginning only. I saw strange creatures, dwarves or something. They were black and moved about. I was in a big place and they were hurting me. They were not human. They were horrible. I was living in a world of orange people. That was real strange. There were a lot of elves. They were prankish, ornery. Maybe 4 of them appeared at the side of a stretch of interstate highway I travel regularly. They commanded the scene. It was their terrain. They were about my height. They held up placards showing me these incredibly beautiful, complex, swirling geometric scenes in them. One of them made it impossible for me to move. There was no issue of control. They were totally in control. They wanted me to look. I heard a giggling sound, the elves laughing or talking at high-speed volume, chattering, twittering. First there was a mandala-like series of visuals, fleur-de-lis type visuals. Then an insect-like thing got right into my face, hovering over me as the drug was going in. This thing sucked me out of my head into outer space. It was clearly outer space, a black sky with millions of stars. I was in a very large waiting room or something. It was very long. I felt observed by the insect thing and others like it. Then they lost interest. I was taken into space and looked at. There is a sinister backdrop, an alien-type, insectoid, not quite pleasant side of this, isn't there? It's not a, we're going to get you, mother. It's more like being possessed. During the experience, there's a sense of someone, or something else, whoever they are, but they certainly are there. I'm aware of them and they're aware of me. It's like they have an agenda. It's like walking into a different neighborhood. You're really not quite sure what the culture is. It's got such a distinct flavor, the reptilian being or beings that are present. It's the sense of the possibility that's so strange. There's nothing that can prepare you for this. There was a sound, a bzzz. It started off and got louder and louder and faster. I was coming on and then pow. There was a space station below me and to my right. There were at least two presences, one on either side of me, guiding me to a platform. I was also aware of many entities inside the space station, automatons, android-like creatures that looked like a cross between crash dummies and the Empire troops from Star Wars, except that they were living beings, not robots. They seemed to have checkerboard patterns on parts of their bodies, especially their upper arms. They were doing some kind of routine technological work and paid no attention to me. In a state of overwhelmed confusion, I opened my eyes. There's this whole different world with architecture and landscape. I saw one or two beings there. The beings even have gender. The skin was not flesh-colored. I communicated with them, but there wasn't enough time. I was so strung out, excited, agitated when I arrived there. They wanted to try and reduce my anxiety so we could relate. There was an initial sense of panic. Then the most beautiful colors coalesced into beings. There were lots of beings. They were talking to me, but they weren't making a sound. It was more as if they were blessing me. The spirits of life were blessing me. They were saying that life was good. At first, I felt like I was going through a cave or a tunnel or into space. At a fast rate, definitely. I felt like a ball hurtling down wherever I was. There was a set of many hands. They were feeling my eyes and face. It was a little bit confusing. There were more individuals. They were recognizing and identifying me. It was more intimate. At first, I thought it was the eye shades on my face, but it definitely was not. To get to that space, I had to get through some sort of a non-benevolent space. It felt like there were talons and claws there trying to guard it in a way. Dismemberment is a part of the shamanic initiation, isn't it? I felt a dragon-like presence, and there were the same colors, red, gold, and yellows. It was wild. There were no colors. There was the usual sound, pleasant, a roar, a sort of internal hum. Then there were three beings, three physical forms. There were rays coming out of their bodies and then back to their bodies. They were reptilian and humanoid, trying to make me understand, not with words but with gestures. They wanted me to look into their bodies. I saw inside them and understood reproduction, what it's like before birth, the passage into the body. Once I established what they were communicating, they didn't just fade away. They stayed there for quite a while. The presence was very solid. I try and program it, and I go in with an idea of what I see. But I just can't. I thought I was developing tolerance, but then, bang! There were these three guys or three things. They were trying to show me as much as possible. They were communicating in words. They were like clowns or jokers or jesters or imps. There were just so many of them doing their funny little thing. I settled into it. I was incredibly still, and I felt like I was in an incredibly peaceful place. Then there was a message telling me that I had been given a gift, that this space was mine and I could go there anytime. I should feel blessed to have form, to live. It went on forever. There were blue hands, fluttering things, then thousands of things flew out of these blue hands. I thought, what a show. It was really healing. It was part of me, not separate. It was a reassurance that this wouldn't go away, that it was mine, that a connection had been made. The whole thing was really crucial in my spiritual development. It's what I tried to do with LSD, a sort of self-initiation. With LSD, it worked in some ways and didn't in others. I went with them as you suggested. There were clinical researchers probing into my mind. There were sort of long fiber optic things that they were putting into my pupils. It was a nursery, a high-tech nursery with a single Gumby, 3 feet tall, attending me. I felt like an infant. Not a human infant, but an infant relative to the intelligences represented by the Gumby. It was aware of me, but not particularly concerned. Sort of attached concern, like a parent would feel looking at a playpen and his 1-year-old lying there. As I went into it, I heard a sound. Then I heard 2 or 3 male voices talking. I heard one of them say, "He's arrived." I felt evolution occurring. These intelligences are looking over us. There is hope beyond the mess we are making for ourselves. I couldn't change the experience at all. I couldn't have anticipated it or even imagined it. It was a total surprise. I tried to open to love, but that was silly. All I could do was observe it. That was much more intense than the first dose. It's a different world. Amazing instruments, machine-type things. There was one person operating some of this stuff. I was in a big room and he was in another part of it. I feel a little shaky, a little hypersensitive. There are little tremors going through my body. There was one big machine in the center with round conduits, almost writhing, not like a snake, more in a technical manner. The conduits were not open at the end. They were solid blue-gray tubes made of plastic. The machine felt as if it was rewiring me, reprogramming me. There was a human, as far as I could tell, standing at some type of console, taking readings or manipulating things. He was busy at work, on the job. I observed some of the results on that machine, maybe from my brain. It was a little frightening, almost unbearably intense. It all began with a whining, whirring sound. There were 4 distinct beings looking down on me, like I was on an operating room table. I opened my eyes to see if it was you and Josette, but it wasn't. They had done something and were observing the results. They are vastly advanced scientifically and technologically. They were looking just over the traction bar in front of me. I guess they were saying, "Goodbye, don't be a stranger. This is real. It's totally unexpected, quite constant and objective. One could interpret you're looking at my pupils as being observed and the tubes in my body as the tubes I'm seeing, but that is a metaphor, and this is not at all a metaphor. It's an independent, constant reality. DMT has shown me the reality that there is infinite variation on reality. There is the real possibility of adjacent dimensions. It may not be so simple as that. There's alien planets with their own societies. This is too proximal. It's not like some kind of drug. It's more like an experience of a new technology than a drug. You can choose to attend to this or not. It will continue to progress without you paying attention. You return not to where you left off, but to where things have gone since you left. It's not a hallucination, but an observation. When I'm there, I'm not intoxicated. I'm lucid and sober. The first thing I noticed was a burning in the back of my neck. Then there was this loud, intense hum. It was like the fan at first, but separate. It began engulfing me. I let it go into it, and then wham! I felt like I was in an alien laboratory in a hospital bed like this, but it was over there. A sort of landing bay or recovery area. There were beings. I was trying to get a handle on what was going on. I was being carted around. It didn't look alien, but their sense of purpose was. It was a 3-dimensional space. I expected cartoon-like creatures, like a commercial for LSD, but this was, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. It was unlike any other DMT experience I've had. They had a space ready for me. They weren't as surprised as I was. It was incredibly unpsychedelic. I was able to pay attention to detail. There was one main creature, and he seemed to be behind it all, overseeing everything. The others were orderlies, or disorderlies. They activated a sexual circuit, and I was flushed with amazing orgasmic energy. A goofy chart popped up like an X-ray in a cartoon, and a yellow illumination indicated that the corresponding system or series of systems were fine. They were checking my instruments, testing things. When I was coming out, I couldn't help but think, aliens. I am so disappointed I didn't talk to them. I was confused and in awe. I knew that they were preparing me for something. Somehow we had a mission. They had things to show me, but they were waiting for me to acquaint myself with the environment and movement and language of this space. It was not like any UFO abduction I've heard about. These beings were friendly. I had a bond with one of them. It was about to say something to me, or me to it, but we couldn't quite connect. It was almost a sexual bond, but not sex like intercourse, but a total body communication. I was filled with feelings of love for them. Their work definitely had something to do with my presence. Exactly what remains a mystery. It started with a sound. It was high-pitched like a tightly taut wire. There were 4 or 5 of them. They were on me fast. As crazy as this sounds, they looked like saguaro cactus, very Peruvian in color. They were flexible, fluid, geometrical cacti, not solid. They weren't benevolent, but they weren't non-benevolent. They probed. They really probed. They seemed to know time was limited. They wanted to know what this being who had shown up was doing. I didn't answer. They knew. Once they decided I was okay, they went about their business. I felt like something was inserted into my left forearm, right here, about 3 inches below this chain-like tattoo on my wrist. It was long. There were no reassurances with the probe, simply business. Maybe at the onset, at just having my ego brushed aside, there was fear. When they were on me, there was a little bit more confusion than fear. Kind of like, hey, what is this? And then they were there. There was no time for me to say, who the hell are you guys? Let's see some ID.
Science can explain everything if we look hard enough.
Shut up, science bitch.
Nothing is true. Everything is real.
Not only is he like ruining my life, but with all this God shit that he's into, he could be ruining my afterlife.
It's a sort of interdimensional vagina that somehow appears. I can interact with it.
Fabric of the entire universe could be torn apart.
I know my mind